Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for getting to our 10th and final meeting of the term and of the year. And it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome Professor Klaus Dodds, especially after the disappointment of March when the snow bomb was threatened here on the hilly region of Stoke-on-Trent. But fortunately, he's come through the driving rain tonight, and he will have to go back tonight to Richmond-on-Thames, where he lives, which we found this week is the. Is it the nice? Does anyone know? It's the nicest place in England to live. Yeah, apparently. Oh, the most pleasant. Generally, it's really good. So you can understand why he wants to get back tonight. And I'll stay here. But seriously, Klaus has been before, and he has always dazzled us with his understanding and his grasp of those remote areas of Antarctica and the Arctic. And I don't know whether there will be any images of him wearing these sort of togs they wear up there in the snow. But we've had other speakers in the past who've talked about those remote wastes, but they've tended to be scientists talking about sustainability and the change in ocean levels and drilling cores into the ice. So they were all people concerned with those issues. And Klaus, of course, is rather different, as you will be hearing, and his expertise is not only on those regions, which many other specialists have not studied, but also more widely on geopolitics, which he's recognized in this country as a leading speaker. And he's written a lot of books, one of which, his latest one, is out there with Nantwich Bookshop. Here it is. It's Border Wars, the conflicts that will define our future. And so it's on a special price of £12 tonight. And so if you'd like to meet Klaus at the interval, he will be signing then. He'll have to rush off, but at the end of the evening, there will probably be some further signed copies if you want to get one after the Q&A. But what we want to do, of course, is to hear not about the border wars, but about the future for the polar regions. And you can see the title. Welcome again, Klaus Dodds.
Thank you very much, and good evening. And I'm delighted to know that Richmond is one of the happiest places in the UK. It has two notable features, if you want to know something about its socioeconomic composition. One is, apparently, it has the highest number of graduates in the UK in that particular constituency. And I think I'm right in saying it had the highest percentage of not wanting Brexit. So Richmond came out top. So that's quite an interesting moment for me to reflect upon, that we do indeed live in a very diverse country. So I'm not getting into that, thank goodness. I'm on, I think, safer ground. Well, maybe not, who knows? So what future for the polar regions? Geopolitics, resources, and climate. And let me, I hope, over the 40-odd minutes that I have to kick things off, really try and give you a sense of why the polar regions matter, what's at stake, and where I think they're going. And what I will try and do is actually not spend too much time on the things that I suspect you'll be reasonably familiar with and comfortable with. You know, if I said, for example, the polar regions are suffering the consequences of a warming climate, I don't think that's going to surprise you. So much of my work is really about the geopolitics, it's about the governance, it's about why we argue over the polar regions, why, for example, perhaps counterintuitively, we sometimes struggle to agree common courses of action when you might imagine, particularly in the Antarctic, where we don't have an indigenous human population. Surely you might think this is the kind of place where we should be able to, frankly speaking, just get along with one another and try and conduct business, in a civil and pleasant manner. So first thing to say, just context. As you know, COP28 has been unfolding in the United Arab Emirates, and it's been an interesting spectacle, if nothing else. I didn't expect to see the Russian flag being represented in the sky by some passing jets. And as you know, there's been an interesting and productive tension between hosting COP28 in a place that has seen its fair share of oil and gas extraction. And at the same time, in COP, every year, there's usually a great deal of activity, usually by academics and activists and others, eager to remind the world that what's at stake, if nothing else, to simply say that whether we like it or not, the polar regions are melting, and that is not a good thing. And it's not a good thing for a number of reasons, but one, if nothing else, is because we know it contributes to global sea rise, and worse still, our oceans are also expanding just simply because they keep on trapping heat. So the polar regions really do feel like they're at the proverbial front line in terms of bearing the brunt. Meanwhile, a few weeks ago in Paris, President Macron was hosting a fairly high-profile event, which was effectively looking at the glaciers and the polar regions. And they issued, at the end of that summit, a declaration for the One Planet, which effectively, yet again, renewed calls for urgent action, recognizing the extraordinary importance of the polar regions. And all of that, you might think, is very reasonable and not necessarily surprising. But actually, what you can't help but notice is over the last 5 or 10 years, there's just been the most extraordinary number of reports, scientific reports, statements, summits, essentially coalescing around the same theme over and over again, that the cryosphere, that is the part of the world that is covered in ice and snow, really does feel like it's under siege at the moment. And one of the things that's been really striking about many of these reports is the sort of work that they're having to do, in essence, to summarize, if you will, as you can see here, why this all matters for policymakers. And so part of what I'm doing in terms of my own work, and last week, for example, I was at the European Parliament in Brussels, is trying to explain why these things matter, and they matter just not only in their own right, in terms of a scientific or an ecological consequence or set of consequences, but they also matter geopolitically. So one thing I'm just going to start with is, unfortunately, an unsettling quality to a lot of what I'm about to talk about, is this rather intuitive view that if the polar regions continue to melt or disappear even, then they become more accessible. So a common trait you'll see about a lot of the discussion, particularly in the Arctic, is retreating ice is enabling, encouraging the possibility for increased competition over access, over resources, over control. And that actually what we're likely to see is a polar geopolitics that might well end up being increasingly confrontational. So not merely competitive, but confrontational. And there are lots of reasons why that might be so. But I just want to make sure that when I get to point 5, I don't neglect the first 4 points. So, ice loss is bad for all kinds of reasons, but let me just reinforce why it's bad. We get biodiversity loss with ice loss. Habitats get lost. Habitats also, however, get transformed. And so just as I'm going to tell you a story about winners and losers in geopolitics in human terms, there are also winners and losers in animal terms. There's an extraordinary story to be told about how the beaver, for example, is moving northwards in the North American Arctic because it's warming. Secondly, ice is, in essence, a critical water resource. We sometimes talk about glaciers as frozen water towers. Glaciers matter, and when glaciers melt, they can either cause catastrophic local flooding in affected communities, or when ice disappears, communities that depend on meltwater for the irrigation of agriculture, for example, are jeopardized. And we're seeing that all over the world. That's not just happening in, for example, the Arctic. Thirdly, and this is something I really will touch upon, is ice melt, or the disappearance of ice, can, on the face of it, also encourage other things, and those other things can also not necessarily be terribly sustainable. So what we're seeing all over the Arctic, and again, as I will sort of develop a little further, is we're seeing more activity, more mining, more fishing, more tourism, including in the Antarctic, and all of this carries with it consequences. It carries with it consequences in terms of an ecological footprint, but it also can carry very helpful consequences. So, for example, in many parts of the Arctic, the mining industry can be an absolutely integral employer of indigenous communities. So you often, in the Arctic, you're seeing firsthand these very difficult trade-offs between whether we want more activity of a certain sort or whether we should prioritize, for example, dealing dramatically and decisively with climate change. Fourthly, as I said before, we shouldn't underestimate sea level rise and the spectre of it. When I was in a meeting in Shanghai in May 2019, a number of Chinese observers noted to me firsthand, there's a reason why China's interested in the Arctic. And one of them, which often gets neglected, is that cities like Shanghai would be extraordinarily vulnerable to rising sea level. And then finally, because this is what I deal with, most of the time I'm talking about geopolitics, and that's what border wars deals with as well. Borders are often and always usually linked with territorial control and access, and they so often can become sources of controversy. And in the Antarctic, we have some very interesting examples of where things can go very, very wrong, even on the face of it. No one necessarily owns Antarctica. Context matters as well. I'm speaking to you in 2023. I apologize for a delayed arrival, courtesy of the British weather and its vagaries. But I'm here in 2023, the end of 2023, and we're still in the midst of a really, really violent, problematic land and sea conflict involving Russia and the Ukraine. And since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, we've had to deal with an extraordinary number of conflict spillovers, as it's called. In other words, we knew as soon as that invasion was launched or unleashed, it was not just going to be about Russia and Ukraine. And very quickly, one of the things we learned, and this has consequences for the polar regions, is that not everybody felt the same way about the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine very quickly discovered who it could count as a friend, who it could count on as an adversary, frankly speaking, beyond Russia, and who was frankly also rather ambivalent about it. So if Ukraine and others thought that the world was going to be united in its condemnation of Russia, then they misjudged that moment very badly. So one of the things we've learned is that there is conflict spillover, and that particularly when I talk to you about the Arctic, it is becoming increasingly obvious that the Arctic is going to become more geopolitically contested and competitive. And Finland's learning that very quickly, because if you want to join NATO, you are going to stimulate a reaction from your near neighbor. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a second. So we've got to confront that, and I'm afraid the Antarctic is not immune from the Russian-Ukraine conflict and everything else that is emanating from it. So, you'll probably be familiar with all the talk about interruption to food supplies, oil price shocks. This is truly a conflict that has had global ramifications, and there's no end in sight for the moment. So what's going on in the polar regions? Well, one way or another, I'm going to touch upon these 7 things in different ways. Number one, I can't get round it. Russia and China are very, very challenging parties, and that includes the polar regions as well. Russia is the most challenging because, candidly, it is a disruptive third party. It doesn't like playing by the rules. It's quick to think of itself as a victim, and it has a serious beef with Western allies who think that they control, amongst other things, regimes, treaties, governance, which then actively disadvantages Russia. President Putin is an expert in escalation. He's also pretty good at de-escalating and putting all the pressure on the other party to decide how to react. China is important just simply because of its presence, and China has legitimate interests and concerns in the polar regions, and China is very, very preoccupied, with, amongst other things, with food security. So sometimes what we call protein geopolitics. You know, there's an awful lot of people who need to be fed in China. So fishing is a major, major preoccupation. Secondly, climate change, I've alluded upon, and we can't get away from it. The poles are undergoing profound change. Thirdly, resources matter. Might be fish, might be coal, might be oil, gas, critical minerals, you name it. The Arctic and the Antarctic are resource hotspots. Fourthly, how do we access the Arctic and the Antarctic? It's changing. 100 years ago, I could have stood here, given a lecture, and you would have laughed at me if I said one day it would be possible to sail across the central Arctic Ocean. That would have been unimaginable. We would have thought of the Arctic Ocean quite reasonably as a frozen desert. We can no longer think of the Arctic Ocean as a frozen desert. So we've got trade routes to think about. We've got shipping routes to think about. And where we call the North Pole, the central Arctic Ocean, that's international waters, and that's becoming increasingly accessible. We've got problems with conflict spillover. We can't assume that just because something bad happens in Ukraine, it won't have ramifications elsewhere. And I'll explain how that's playing out in the polar regions. Final 2 things. We've got a real challenge with so-called grey zone activities. What grey zone activity means is when parties engage in things that might not be strictly illegal, but nonetheless look and feel like they're not being done for the right reasons. So you might, for example, think, it's not a problem, is it, if we have more drone activity in Antarctica? What could be wrong with that? But then you get to think about, well, what can you do with drones? How might you turn a drone into something a little bit more sinister than something that, say, a scientist might use? We're getting a little bit more of that in the polar regions. And then finally, we are seeing more strategic competition. This is true across the world. We talk about the return of great power competition for a reason. The United States, Russia, China, and their allies are unquestionably locked into a competition for friends, allies, resources, access, you name it. I'm not necessarily saying the Cold War is back, because that parallel doesn't quite work, but nonetheless, we're in a more competitive and intensive era. Health warning. I have to say this. Please, we must not conflate the Arctic with the Antarctic. We must not think the penguin lives in the Arctic. We must not think the polar bear lives in the Antarctic. My children would never forgive me. Or more importantly, I would never forgive my children if they made that mistake. So, what can be said about the 2 regions? Well, you'll forgive me if you can't necessarily see all the detail, but let me just draw out 2 things for you. First of all, the Arctic is huge, but 50% of the Arctic is under Russian sovereignty. So whether we like it or not, and whether Russia likes it or not, Russia is de facto the dominant Arctic power. There are 7 other Arctic states, and if you work your way around a ring, if you will, or the Arctic Circle, that would be Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, Greenland, Canada, and the United States via Alaska. Antarctica is rather different in the sense of we don't have quite the same political geography. Huge continent surrounded by a very large ocean. The Arctic, of course, the Arctic Ocean is a semi-enclosed ocean surrounded by land masses, Europe, Asia, and America. So these are very different places. The Arctic has 4 million people. The Antarctic might have, in the height of summer, 10, 20,000 people, maybe. 100,000 people visit Antarctica as tourists, but we're talking about a tiny, tiny residual population. And the geopolitical context also matters because whilst we have 8 Arctic states, we have 7 claimant states in the Antarctic. So the map you see on the left matters because the 7 claimant states think they are claimant states, and they take those claims very seriously. Note 2 things. Britain's claim overlaps with Argentina and Chile, a challenge for us. Think about the new Argentine president. That's not good from the UK's point of view. That's something to watch. And then the second thing is, just think about who isn't represented on that map as claimant. The United States, Russia, China, India, and the list goes on. So it's a very, very small number of states. It's not clear who owns Antarctica, in short. China wouldn't accept any of those claims. Let's be clear about that. And let's also be clear that the Arctic is becoming more and more interesting, partly because states are becoming a lot more invested in securing their offshore rights at sea. You may have seen the news involving Venezuela and Guyana recently. Yeah. Classic border conflict. It's all about offshore oil and gas potential in Guyana. And Venezuela thinks that bit of Guyana belongs to Caracas and not Georgetown, and we've got a very interesting situation, which I'm writing about and will be published tomorrow. So there you go, a plug for my latest short piece of work. But in the Arctic, we've got, and these maps are more complicated, and really the takeaway that I want to leave you with is that the Arctic states are mobilizing. They're mobilizing to try and establish their sovereign rights over the ocean. So that map of the Arctic Ocean is becoming more complicated, and that's raising the stakes, and they're doing it because they want to protect their resource and access rights. But they're also having to be comfortable with the idea with that others also have rights. They have rights to navigate through, and those international waters don't belong to anyone in particular. They belong to everybody. So we've got a very interesting situation here, particularly in the Arctic, where some countries want to harden their grip on the area, understandably perhaps, and others are very, very eager to say, we have rights in these areas, you can't exclude us. So that creates tensions. Now, the other thing we shouldn't forget when we talk about the Arctic is a homeland. The Arctic is home to indigenous peoples, and Sarah Olsvig there you see on the left is a Greenlandic woman. She's one of the most, in my opinion, elegant defenders and advocates of indigenous rights in the Arctic. And across the Arctic, the relationship between indigenous and non-indigenous varies, but in a nutshell, 95% of Greenland is indigenous. In somewhere like Russia, for example, the indigenous community is far smaller and far less empowered than it would be in Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and so on. But indigenous communities are bearing the brunt of climate change, and indigenous communities are very concerned that they're being squeezed out as great powers struggle for influence and access, and states seek to consolidate their grip on the region. And then suddenly indigenous people become a bit of an inconvenience. They're another layer of complexity. So Sarah Olsvik and others are very, very determined to say, you can't do anything without us. However, other people are less preoccupied with indigenous rights and far more preoccupied with making sure the Russian Federation is in the very best shape that it possibly can be. So for the last 15, 20 years, President Putin has been very, very quick to remind Russian citizens and the world more generally that Russia is a polar power. And Arthur Chilingarov on the right-hand side, the man who helped to plant a Russian flag at the bottom of the Central Arctic Ocean in August 2007, is also very fond of reminding his audiences that the Arctic is Russian, or at least 50% of it is, and possibly more. So you can see where this might be potentially going. 50% of the Arctic is Russian. President Putin has been quite clear the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation is integral to the future of Russia. Mining resources matter to Russia, and they will continue to mine and exploit, regardless of what climate change might warn them against. Russia has a sea route that runs along the top of Russia called the Northern Sea Route. It is very, very keen to develop that. Who's working with them closely to develop the Northern Sea Route? China. And one of the consequences of imposing sanctions against Russia following the annexation of Crimea about a decade ago was, of course, to strengthen that relationship with China. And China was only too eager to get involved because China wants oil and gas, Russia has to sell oil and gas, India doesn't mind it either, thank you very much. And they have a mutual interest in opening that Northern Sea Route, or if nothing else, expanding it. And the other thing is we mustn't forget, whether we like it or not, the Northern Fleet, is located in the Kola Peninsula in Russian, and that is home of Russia's nuclear deterrent, and it still remains substantial. So Russia takes the Arctic very seriously. Russia has what's called a bastion defense approach, which means that it will use all measures possible, as it did during the Cold War, to make sure it protects that part of European Russia. And of course, if you're Finland, joining NATO, and Sweden may yet, of course, be part of that, you're going to bear the brunt of that determination to defend the Federation. And that's why, frankly speaking, over the last 20 years, Russia has been investing and modernizing its military capabilities, and some of that includes creating drone squadrons, some of that includes upgrading bases. Russia has, in essence, under Putin, been very, very clear that the Arctic matters to Russia, and the humiliating years of Boris Yeltsin, if you remember Boris Yeltsin, sometimes couldn't get off an aircraft because the in-flight entertainment had taken its toll. Well, things need to change, and so Putin's been very clear, things will change. We're not allowing Russia to be humiliated in the way that it was. So what else has been going on in this space? Well, Russia, again, has been very clear. You sanctioned us. We've been looking for opportunities elsewhere. We pivoted east and south. We've got other players and parties involved in our Russian infrastructure projects. So one of the interesting things about UAE and COP28 was actually quite timely, a good reminder that UAE is another strategic ally of Russia. By the way, another close strategic ally of Russia is Venezuela. So if you're asking yourself why Venezuela is acting in the way that it is in the context of Guyana, just remember that the president has visited Moscow at least once. So Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, India, China, Vietnam, South Africa are strategic allies of Russia. And that means that these companies, these parties, are enabling Russia to continue its business in the Arctic despite Western sanctions. There are a no-limits relationship, allegedly, and arms sales and energy supplies make for a pretty toxic combination. So we're going to see a lot of this. We're going to see a lot of swing states, as I'm calling them, states that will blow in the wind, states that will support Russia as and when required, but like India, will also look the other way and welcome, for example, British delegations eager to improve trade. There'll be no contradiction. This is swing state politics This is opportunism writ large. We don't have long-term allyship. We just do what is tactically and strategically appropriate. So this pivot to Asia will continue, and I just wanted to quickly show you some of the maps so you get a sense of what's going on. The Russian Arctic will continue to be developed, but instead of gas in particular going as it did until quite recently west to places like Germany famously, it's going to go south and it's going to go east. And a lot of this will continue at pace. When it comes to shipping, for example, Russia continues to invest in the Northern Sea route, which you can see there on the right-hand side. And if you're wondering about the Northwest Passage, the historic Northwest Passage, far less commercially important. And one of the reasons, frankly speaking, is simply down to ocean currents and wind. Unbelievably, for Russia, diminishing sea ice, coupled with prevailing currents and wind direction, means that the remaining ice tends to congregate on the top of North America and Greenland. And increasingly, the waters north of Russia are becoming clear of ice. So it's becoming a more accessible route. And the Russians are sailing more ships through that route in the winter period. And yet again, that would have been unthinkable not so long ago. So things are conspiring, you might say. China's busy imagining itself as a near-Arctic state, and maps like this are just a reminder to you that China has and will continue to have large ambitions, both transcontinentally, but also to the north of the Arctic. So again, it's really important to say that China and Russia, that relationship has its tensions. It really does. But on the other hand, for now, they are aligning well with one another. And that means other countries are getting nervous. So Canada is getting increasingly nervous about what China might be doing in the rest of the Arctic. And this was just a news story from earlier this year about discovering Chinese underwater buoys. You're also getting increasing interest in the Central Arctic Ocean as a space of international waters that may become ever more contested. What might be there? Well, one thing that could happen, and it is possible, as ocean temperatures begin to change and alter elsewhere, fish stocks might go northwards. So what would have again been utterly inconceivable not so long ago, we might yet see commercial fishing at the top of the world. And again, 40, 50 years ago, the only thing that would have been able to visit these waters would have been a nuclear-powered icebreaker or, of course, a nuclear-powered submarine going underneath the ice. You know, things are changing quickly. And then, of course, we're also having to recognize that governance, how we do business in the Arctic, has become more challenging. So, as a consequence of the invasion of Ukraine being launched in early 22, the Arctic Council that had been really helping to forge better relationships between those 8 Arctic states paused its business because the 7 decided they couldn't work with Russia anymore. Understandably so. The problem you have, however, is precisely because Russia is so enormous, pausing the work of the Arctic Council means effectively you're saying that actually you're not doing business with 50% of the Arctic. And what we're seeing increasingly is the Arctic being split in two, a Western Arctic and a Russian-Asian Arctic. And that's probably not good, as many scientists would say, because if you want to understand what's going on in the Arctic, you need to have access to all of the Arctic. So this is really, really, I think, unfortunate. And the prospects are not good for resuming the work formally. So we're looking at potentially a very different kind of Arctic, a split Arctic. You know, an Arctic that, for now, just looks really difficult because parties can't get along. And of course, whether we like it or not, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, whilst utterly understandable, will yet again be seen by President Putin as an extraordinary provocation. And that's going to carry with it tensions. and the unwelcome prospect of potential mishap and miscalculation. Earlier this year, recognizing that the Arctic is changing, the UK launched its Arctic policy framework, and effectively what it says, as you might expect it to say, is the UK is going to have to devote, whether it likes it or not, more resources to the Arctic and is going to have to support its northern allies like Finland and Sweden. And it's not like we don't have lots of other funding priorities to worry about, but it's really clear you're going to have to spend money on this, I'm afraid. How that plays out with a possible change of government next year is a speculation. Right, very quickly, let me talk to you about the Antarctic. So there is once again a story here to tell about cooperation that used to exist that is now struggling to prevail. Last year at the Antarctic Treaty meeting, the Antarctic Treaty being the treaty that governs Antarctica, that promotes science and cooperation, we had the extraordinary spectacle of delegates walking out of the Berlin meeting when the Russian delegation was about to speak. Unheard of. So diplomatic work at the moment is really tough. And the German host was absolutely unequivocal in her condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Remember, Russia and Ukraine are both members of the Antarctic Treaty. It's deeply, deeply awkward. And it's also awkward because we suspect that Russia might be prospecting for minerals in the Antarctic, which would be very much against the spirit of the Antarctic Treaty. So again, we're just confronted over and over again with difficult, challenging behavior. And then the pressure is always on the other parties. What do you do about that? You don't surely want Russia to leave the Antarctic Treaty system. You don't want it to walk away from a treaty, because that's arguably even more dangerous. So how do you deal with these things? And it all matters because the Antarctic Treaty says, look, we know we've had some difficulties over who owns Antarctica, but this is what we're supposed to sign up to. We're supposed to agree we demilitarize Antarctica since 1959. We don't talk about territorial claims because that's not helpful. We all invest in scientific cooperation and think it's a good thing. We believe in consensus. That means we all have to agree on everything, which is challenging. And it also means that we've had to, and we recognize this, we've had to come up with different agreements over time to deal with stuff that we know is awkward as well. Fishing, environmental protection, dealing with whaling, that kind of thing. But we do so on the basis of consensus and that everybody tries to get along. Now, the problem is we're finding it harder to get along with one another. You would think everybody would agree that marine conservation is a good thing. We don't want to see the Southern Ocean being overfished. We don't want to see fish stocks being destroyed. Or do we? Because for everybody who speaks eagerly on marine conservation, there are others who say, no, we have a right to develop commercial fishing. And why are you telling us that we can't fish in the numbers that we would wish? And what we're seeing, sadly, in the Southern Ocean increasingly is all the familiar arguments you've seen and heard elsewhere in the North Sea and other parts of the world, where you've got this trade-off between fishing and conservation. You're arguing over what is the best scientific evidence. But you're also dealing, I'm afraid to say it's a familiar story, you're dealing with some countries that just seem to enjoy being disruptive. Just find it very difficult to resist the temptation. And I'm afraid Russia is the worst again. But China's not far behind. So we are struggling with this issue. We're struggling to agree about environmental protection. How much? How far? And are some parties using environmental protection cynically to stop other parties doing things they would like to do? And that might be fishing, that might be building new bases, or whatever. And the sad thing is, about all of this, particularly in the Antarctic, is science is being politicized. Science is being weaponized. Science is being caught up in disinformation. So one of the great frustrations of polar scientists is that they think they're not being taken seriously. they're not being listened to. They're not being seen as reliable, reasonable, neutral producers of knowledge. So unfortunately, geopolitics is interfering with science. And that's, I think, a personal collective tragedy to many polar scientists. It's becoming very, very awkward. So just to give you a few final illustrations, and this is why I was at the European Parliament, actually, last week. The European Parliament is super interested in Antarctica. It doesn't quite know how to translate that enthusiasm into policy, but it cares deeply about marine conservation. And can you see up there, you might see Weddell Sea MPA proposal, East Antarctic MPA proposal, Antarctic Peninsula MPA. MPA just means marine protected area. And what these these are really huge areas, by the way, of the sea. What you're doing with the marine protected areas, you're saying, please don't fish there. Because we want to preserve fish stocks, we want to preserve that part of the Southern Ocean. And what we're trying to do, and this is one of the goals we've set ourselves, is we're trying to get 30% of the world's oceans by 2030 under some kind of protection, marine conservation protection. If we cannot get areas like this around the Antarctic protected, we are never going to get to 30%. So this is really fundamental stuff. And we are struggling to get these protected areas agreed because parties think, unfortunately, that other parties aren't negotiating in good faith. And it cuts both ways. It's not always naughty old Russia and China, everybody else is virtuous. To be also fair and clear, one of the biggest exploiters of fishing is Norway. So it's not a simple east versus west split. But we are struggling in terms of good faith. So it's a real challenge. And we're struggling to regulate those fishing, and it's also throwing up lots of interesting tensions. So Russia and the UK fell out with one another over fishing of what's called Patagonian toothfish. You might know it as Chilean sea bass, if you've ever seen it, in and around South Georgia, which is a UK overseas territory. America got involved, and yet again, fishing and marine conservation got unhelpfully, in my opinion, unhelpfully politicized. It just makes seeking consensus and agreement so much harder. And as I say, yes, we can identify China and others as major fishing players, but when it comes to krill, which are these shrimp-like creatures that are used in fish food, for example, we shouldn't underestimate that the biggest player here is Norway. And there's always this interesting paradox with Norway. It has this kind of, on the one hand, this environmental reputation, but it's also pretty ruthless, actually, in exploiting oil, gas, and fish. It's a big, big player. Okay, final couple of things I want to talk to you about. I hope I'm making it clear that one of the big wedge issues at the moment is fishing versus conservation in Antarctica. That's proving really, really difficult. That's the British delegation. Jane Rumble there, the lady in the middle of the picture, is our lead polar diplomat. And she has the unenviable task every year of trying to negotiate fishing conservation agreements for the Southern Ocean. It's a thankless task at times. And whether we like it or not, that great power rivalries, that strategic competition is also coming to Antarctica. And just to finish off on this note for you is to say that China and Russia, remember, haven't made a claim to the Antarctic yet. But they certainly are thinking about a future where the Antarctic Treaty and all the restraints that it introduces may no longer be there. So one of the things we're noticing across the Antarctic is more and more interest and investment in scientific stations and infrastructure. Because in the end, you don't have people there, so you've got to be doing things. You've got to be seen to have a presence. So China's preparing a 5th Antarctic station, and this is worrying other countries like Australia that think they're just going to be overwhelmed by China, just because of its sheer size and the resources it can throw at things. We're busy investing ourselves. We're concerned about this in the UK. We've got a newish polar vessel called the Sir David Attenborough. We're upgrading our research stations. We're throwing quite a lot of money at British Antarctic territory, which is 3 times the size of the UK. The EU, I think, and I hope, certainly if I've played my part, can you imagine the irony of being a British third-party citizen telling the EU what it should be doing in the European Parliament? They found that very funny, I can tell you. Thankfully, I came from Richmond, so they said that's fine. We know all about Richmond. Okay. So there's lots of interest in the Antarctic, some of it good, some of it not so good, and lots of organizations, including the only United Nations agency located in London, the International Maritime Organization, is also getting more interested in the Antarctic and Arctic. Introduced a polar code for shipping not so long ago, threw it 4 or 5 years ago. Why? Because the Arctic and Antarctic are opening up. They're becoming more accessible. And the IMO realized that we had to act. We had to try and get some standards. Otherwise, things will go horribly wrong. Right, I promise, last slide. Here, we're done. And just like to keep you waiting. How many more slides to go? All right, I'm finishing on 39. 39 steps? I don't know, I just had a 39 in my mind. So let me leave you with this. We can't take anything for granted. The Arctic and Antarctic are changing very, very rapidly. I've mentioned climate change. Let me just leave you the latest unwelcome news. Avian bird flu has been discovered in the Antarctic. It's just another illustration that the Antarctic is not isolated anymore. We've got problems with all kinds of things coming and going from the Antarctic. This, unfortunately, is just the latest challenge found in skuas, which are like very aggressive seagulls. And I can attest to that personally, having been to the Antarctic a number of times, and dive bombed by skuas. It's quite a scary business. Secondly, we should absolutely worry about governance in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. They are being stress tested at the moment. And please don't assume just because they're remote spaces, exemplary behavior always prevails. And sadly, it doesn't. Thirdly, yes, you've heard me say it repeatedly, China and Russia are disruptive. But let's also be fair. You know, China and Russia often are thought of as disruptive because they don't do what we want them to do. And there may be good reasons why sometimes they're disruptive. And then finally, I think it is fair to say that China and Russia argue that countries like the UK, the US, and others are also perfectly capable of putting science and environmental protection that seem very virtuous, putting it to use for their own ends. And they would argue, and I think it's a good challenge to us, that we shouldn't think just because we think we have virtue on our side, everybody else agrees with us. You know, it is a contested world, and as Ukraine discovered in February 2022, not everybody rushed to their defense. So if there's any complacency lingering, then we need to banish that, because you know this is a competitive world, this is a congested world, and we don't have the last say, and we never did when it comes to the polar regions. I'll stop there, otherwise I'm abusing your goodwill. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Hope that was the right time.
But we'll kick off with something that was triggered, Klaus, by some of the slides. And so we've got, this is basically about your maps of unclaimed territory, inverted commas, belonging or claimed by various people. So shall we start off with the unclaimed bit? Linda and John Sherwood asking, your map showed an unclaimed area of the Antarctic. Why is this area not claimed? And how does a nation go about claiming a bit of it? And why has neither Russia or China done this? Haven't they as much right as we've got?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sorry, I say the talk was very much really intended to be a teaser and to leave you exactly what I hoped you would, ask brilliant questions like this. So, which may well be a preamble to saying I might not be able to answer all your questions. Okay, but this one I can. It's a really great question. So you're absolutely right. I didn't dwell on the fact that there is a so-called unclaimed sector, sometimes called the Pacific Ocean sector. And it's really the only part of the Earth's surface, actually, that's never been formally claimed by a nation state, of any substance anyway. That doesn't mean we don't have other no man's lands and such things, but it is an oddity. So how are those 7 claims made historically? Historically, claims to territory tend to be made through a number of ways. One is discovery and exploration, as you'd expect. Another is mapping and surveying. Another is, crucially in the polar regions, you have to establish presence, what's called effective occupation. In other words, you have to look like you're doing something. So for much of the 20th century, scientists often had to perform, whether they liked it or not, 2 roles. One is they were scientists, and then on the other hand, they also helped to establish presence. And to this day, British Antarctic Survey, which is our premier science organisation, has as its task supporting effective presence in the British Antarctic Territory. So, when you see all those 7 claims, in other words, all those countries' concerns followed those kinds of steps, but what you also do, you use your national parliaments to say, we're articulating a formal claim, we're going to call it, in our case, what used to be called the Falkland Islands Dependencies. It became the British Antarctic Territory in the 1960s. And there's a, if you will, a sort of choreography to how you do these things. Now, the Pacific Ocean sector was never claimed because it was the remotest part of the Antarctic, the most difficult bit to reach. And then by the time the other countries had made their claims, and you saw they were like pie slices or cake slices, I suppose. And to a certain extent, the claims, they're all a little bit of a work of fiction. You know, what they say is we look at a map and we think, well, we've sort of discovered and explored up to here, up to there, and before you know it, you use lines of latitude, and that's how you end up with the pie slice or the cake slice. The British, at one stage in the early 1920s, had the plan of colonizing, claiming all of Antarctica. Now, unfortunately for them, a number of other countries said, hang on a minute. And the French said in 1923, we've actually got a claim to Antarctica. And so it went on like this. And the Argentines and Chileans said, well, we have a claim. And then the great idea in the 1920s and 30s was, could we get the Americans to claim this bit? This would be so helpful. They didn't do it. They thought about it. They didn't do it. And by 1950, the Soviet Union said, we're also thinking about making a claim to the Antarctic. So the reason why the Americans never made a claim to the Antarctic was because they were worried by the onset of the Cold War in the late 1940s, early 1950s, it would provoke the Soviet Union to make a counterclaim. So that's where we are. 7 claimant states, 1 unclaimed, an Antarctic treaty that says, forget about the claims for now. And we know perfectly well that China thinks of the Antarctic as a global common and doesn't accept any of those claims. That's where we are. And that's the oddity of the Pacific Ocean sector. The Americans, I suspect, and the Russians would think, not unreasonably, if we were going to make a claim to the Antarctic, it'd be a lot bigger than a Pacific Ocean sector. Just warning you now. So, watch out.
We've got several questions. They're scattered around, but let's just start. Marie Potter, you've partly answered her question about what are the... I don't know if there are any further rules that you want to mention. Some of the words you're using.
Let me say one other thing, because this is highly pertinent for the events that are unfolding at the moment, which could be quite disturbing in Venezuela and Guyana. So there's a similar principle at stake here. The crucial thing when you make a territorial claim is whether other parties recognize that claim. There's only been a couple of countries that have formally recognized British Antarctic territory, and that is our friendly claimant states, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, France. British Antarctic territory has never been recognized as legitimate by Argentina and Chile because they claim their own territory over almost exactly the same space, and nobody else has recognized, formally speaking, those claims. So if others don't recognize your claim, you're in a bit of a precarious position. So recognition matters enormously. My worry is if Venezuela does something foolish in Guyana, Russia will be quick to recognize Venezuela's opportunism. That's challenging.
I think you've answered Murray Potter and Mike Hill's questions about how people go about making claims. If they don't, if either of you disagree with that, please ask for the microphone. But Murray Potter also says, how is it policed? And I'll have another question like that in a while.
Antarctica is exceptional in the sense that if you don't have any agreement over who owns Antarctica, it's very difficult then to think about how things like law and order and jurisdiction work if nobody quite knows who owns the place in practice. So what happens is, if most of us in the room are British citizens, just allow me to be lazy and assume that for a second, any legislation that the UK government applies to British Antarctic territory applies to us as British citizens. It certainly does not apply to Argentine citizens who would think, not unreasonably, they're in Argentine Antarctic territory, not British Antarctic territory. So Antarctica is a real oddity like that. If there's legislation that applies to Antarctica, it only applies to the citizens of the country that has issued that legislation. So it's a very, very unusual place to be. And the only rules of engagement, really, is the Antarctic territory, a treaty, I beg your pardon, which says this has to be demilitarized, this has to be denuclearized, you have to behave in a certain way. The difficulty always is enforcement. So if Russia behaves badly, or China behaves badly, or Britain behaves badly, you've got a real challenge on your hand because the governance system is all about consensus. And consensus means, unfortunately, that sometimes you have to let things go because if you don't, you risk breaking consensus and you may not have an Antarctic treaty. It's a really difficult trade-off.
So this is one of the few places in the world where an Irish passport isn't particularly useful.
No. No. And by the way, Ireland is talking about signing the Antarctic Treaty because of the Great Shackleton connection, amongst other things. Haven't done it yet, but they might yet do it. So.
We've got right. We can talk about Svalbard. You may need to explain it to remind everyone what that's about. But let's hear from John Mottram.
Yes. Am I on? Am I on? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Klaus, for a great lecture. Yeah, could I ask you to say something about Svalbard? Last week we had a lecture about the generations. So anyone here's generation pre-war will know it as Spitsbergen. But us baby boomers, I think we've grown up with it being Svalbard. Could you say something about the archipelago, split between Russia and Norway, and the coal mines, and so on? Thank you.
Yeah, no, certainly can. I've been to Svalbard many times myself. The main island is called Spitsbergen, but you're absolutely right, the Svalbard archipelago. So Svalbard is interesting. Its governance is effectively based on what is called the Svalbard Treaty, which dates from 1920. And all kinds of signatories to the Svalbard Treaty are to be found, including North Korea. The treaty is very clear. Svalbard is a Norwegian territory, full stop. So there's nothing split between one country and another, it's Norwegian territory. However, the treaty also says something quite interesting. It says that Norway, despite enjoying full sovereignty over Svalbard, is not allowed to install military infrastructure facilities. It has to be kept demilitarized, and any signatory has to enjoy equal rights with Norway. Over time, the Russians in particular established a settlement called Barentsburg. And one of Little Life's ironies is coal mining, as you rightly say, was a major activity. And so there's a rich history of Russians and Ukrainians digging for coal in Svalbard and sending that coal back to the Russian Federation. Now, the joke is, coal mining is so unprofitable. There's always been a slightly naughty story, which is Russia imported coal from the Federation to Svalbard to make it look like they were actually doing something. There's there's probably some truth in that. It's not, you can imagine, who mines for coal in Svalbard? Well, you mine for coal because, remember I talked about effective occupation. You want to look like you're doing something. Okay, so from Norway's got a sort of difficult problem with Svalbard. You've got to follow the Svalbard Treaty. Part of the price that Norway has to bear, though, is you've got to be careful how you treat those third parties. And those third parties are going to provoke you. They're going to push you a little bit. And Russia is very good at poking and prodding. And it does things that test Norway. And so what increasingly Norway's got is it's really a bit of a dilemma about how you treat Svalbard. And recently what Russia has done, which is really genius, I have to say, is what they've said in Barentsburg is they've invited so-called BRIC countries, the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, South Africa. They said, would you like to come and work with us in Barentsburg? Well, this drives Norway really, really, makes them mad, because they set up something called Ny-Ålesund, which is a settlement, a science park, and Norway wanted everybody in Ny-Ålesund because it can control them, because we've got a station there. The Brits have a place. But Russia is just, it's really clever because it's just putting Norway on the defensive. And then the other thing, which is another complication, is the Svalbard Treaty was negotiated in 1920. Way, way, way before what was called the Law of the Sea, that dealt with all the exclusive economic territorial sea stuff that we now are quite familiar with. Question: does the Law of the Sea apply to the Svalbard Treaty? In other words, does Norway have an exclusive economic zone around Svalbard? Russia says no, or niet. So big argument to come over fishing. What do you do with fishing? What do you do with resource exploitation? Norway's got a real dilemma there, how to handle Svalbard. During the Cold War, Svalbard was seen as a potential flashpoint for a Third World War. It's interesting, the language of flashpoint is being used again.
Just, we don't want to spend too much time on Svalbard, but Ian Brown sort of started off the same question. He wonders whether it's now time for the United Nations to step up and carry out an effective role managing the polar regions. Does that fill you with horror?
Well, in a way, maybe you picked up on what I said in passing, I admit. The United Nations is already involved in the polar regions in two ways. Number one, the International Maritime Organization recently passed a polar code. That's the UN getting involved. And that polar code, by the way, is all about safe, secure shipping. And that was a really important intervention. I mean, there is a lot of reckless behavior in polar waters. And the polar code at least is trying to keep shipping safe and secure. And we should be grateful for that. The other way the United Nations is involved is through the legal framework of the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. But to be perfectly clear, if you're looking for the United Nations General Assembly to work its magic in the polar regions, you may end up being disappointed. What we have had, though, is the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, recently went to Antarctica. I don't know if you saw that. He was making a few little short videos. And he issued a very powerful plea, as you would imagine, to think of Antarctica as ground zero for climate change. There is no desire on the part of any party, serious party, to have more United Nations involvement. Not wanted. And you can think why that might be so.
Zeno and Harry, our students have come up with a few questions. Let's try this one. And they wonder whether there are any actual laws that regulate the borders in the Arctic that were on you said they were a bit vague, but are they, and does anyone patrol them, or is that too contentious given these various claimants that are around? I mean, we see border, you've written border wars, and there are lots of borders and walls and goodness knows what. Presumably it's rather difficult to put up a chain link fence.
It's very tricky. As you would imagine, The Arctic and the Antarctic are large, difficult to operate spaces. And whatever climate change is doing to the Arctic and the Antarctic, some things don't change. The Arctic and the Antarctic are very dark places for 6 months of the year. That doesn't change. They may be a little bit warmer, they may be a little bit wetter, but they're still dark places. The other problem in the Arctic is the military and everything that goes with it perform two roles. In Russia in particular, the Russian military defend, deter, exercise sovereignty, all the things you'd expect a military to do. But they're also absolutely crucial in supplying and supporting remote coastal communities all around the Russian Arctic. So they've always had this double role. Essential support element for civilian communities, but they also have this more offensive capability. And one of the things that makes borders very difficult as well is some countries have the capability of traveling under the ice discreetly without necessarily telling anyone, and some don't. So one of the uncomfortable truths the Canadians had to endure during the Cold War was Russian submarines, Soviet submarines, American submarines, and British submarines were perfectly capable of coming in and out of Canadian waters without asking permission. And that was a little bit unsettling. At the moment, China doesn't, by the way, if you're wondering, China does not have a polar submarine capability. I'm absolutely confident China will have a polar submarine capability in the next 20 years. So I think you're going to see that, whether you like it or not, borders are really quite difficult, actually, to patrol and protect. Finland is going to find its border being well and truly tested. And by the way, you can, as you've seen with Finland, if you've been following the news, you can weaponize migrants. There are lots of different ways of testing the border. You don't always have to do it through military capability.
Jo Sexton sort of wants, she's not taking issue with you, but she wants to ask you a question. You criticized Russia and China in some of your slides as disruptive, and she's wondering whether the United States is lily-white in comparison with them.
I accept the challenge. It's a good challenge. Do you know, it's interesting. It's probably quite fashionable to criticize the United States in some quarters. I think in the case of the Antarctic, actually there's a lot of good things that the United States does. I probably should have made it clearer when I spoke about this. The United States does not have any commercial fishing interest in the Southern Ocean, full stop. And one of the reasons why we had what was called, you may have just caught it on one of the maps, the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. You may have seen that. It was one of the big protected areas. That in large part was due to the really very impressive statesman-like behavior of John Kerry. And the United States really led and championed on that marine protected area. I think we're able to do so because they didn't have a commercial fishing interest. So they could say, look, we really are interested in marine conservation. We don't, by the way, make a claim to Antarctica. It's one of the few things the US don't do. And so maybe just once we could act in a semi-virtuous way. But let's not forget, the United States also reserves the right to make a territorial claim. And if Donald Trump is elected president, my worry is he might discover Antarctica. Remember, he discovered Greenland in 2019 during his first, which made the Danes really very nervous, understandably so.
Can we open a few holiday brochures now to answer Mark Dormer's question? What is your perspective on the pros and cons of increasing tourism in the polar regions?
So I think I should come clean and say I've been to the Antarctic 5 times. I have loved every visit with great passion and enthusiasm, and I'm not going to be a hypocrite and say you shouldn't go to the Antarctic. The question I have, I suppose, in my own mind is, at what point do we say, however, that we don't really want to see numbers exceeding a particular point? So do we think, for example, 200,000 visitors would be a little bit excessive? Got to remember, the most accessible part of the Antarctic is the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the closest to Argentina and Chile. And the 100,000 figure I quoted you Around 90% of that is concentrated in the Antarctic Peninsula, and about 90% of that is ship-based. And you may or may not remember a ship called Explore that sank in 2007. Thankfully, no lives were lost. But inevitably, we've just got to be sensible, I think, about Antarctic tourism. And just think we don't have the infrastructure for search and rescue. And if lots and lots of people are visiting relatively small sites, we just have to recognize there is a cost to all of that. Flip side, however, is 99% of Antarctica will really not be touched by the vast majority of humanity. So it's a trade-off. And for countries like Argentina and Chile, Antarctic tourism is really quite profitable and also quite vital for towns in the south that often feel and indeed look neglected by governments far north. Antarctic tourism is also hugely beneficial to the Falkland Islands, because it's often a stopping off point for some of that work. So the islanders also benefit from the tourism. My main concern is ecological footprint and impact, and my main concern is search and rescue. God forbid one of those larger ships goes down and we don't have ships in close proximity to execute a rescue.
Were you ever seasick?
Sorry?
Well, someone I met said 3/4 of the people on the 1-month holiday were seasick at any one time.
I come from a seafaring family. I'm very lucky. But I will say, ladies and gentlemen, the Drake's Passage, they either call it the Drake's Quake or the Drake's Lake. There's nothing in between, and I've had both. First time, Force 11 storms for 3 days. That was quite testing.
We've got some climate questions. Jackie here is asking, she's concerned about the forests of Russia being at risk of being sawn down to make way for agriculture and more wealth and power for Russia. Just hold that thought. Yep. June Avison, I think, has got a really interesting question here. It's about language, and you've used some very carefully judged language to make this presentation out. She's not challenging that. She's just mentioning that in a recent article, George Monbiot, who many here may know, he suggests we need a different language to talk about a lot of these issues. So he described the seriousness of the climate. He says we should say natural world instead of the environment, because who's ever seen the environment? And climate breakdown instead of change. And he posits the 6th mass extinction is imminent, and that we're in an omni-crisis. So you go from the little problem of a few forests being chopped down in Russia to the omni-doom of George Monbiot. Would you like to sort of see, and June wants to know how far you agree with Monbiot.
So George Monbiot is obviously, as you know, a well-known journalist, and I think journalists have a different kind of artistic, creative license, I think, than academics. And, if I wanted to make 30-second TikTok videos and relentlessly seek and search headlines, I'm sure I could adopt a different style. My own view is that by nature, partly because I've been around a lot of diplomats, and is to be fairly cautious about the way that I speak. I won't shy away from using words like disruptive powers. But I'm also, and it's out of respect to my scientific colleagues, I don't study climate change. And I think it's far more powerful for you to hear from scientists talk about climate breakdown, for example, as opposed to me. So I think it's really about a style, but I certainly would have no hesitation in concurring that what I've also physically witnessed in the Arctic and the Antarctic is really discombobulating. It is unsettling. It is unsettling to see the greening of Antarctica, for example. It is unsettling to read about reports of avian bird flu, and so on and so forth. It's a really interesting question about forestry and vegetation. The biggest problem the Arctic has with regards to forestry is that it burns. I'm less concerned about timber and the forestry industry, which of course Finland is rather enthusiastic, engaged with. I'm far more concerned about wildfires. Wildfires are profound in the Arctic. I remember landing in Alaska and Fairbanks Airport And everywhere you looked, there was smoke, kind of extraordinary wildfire. I've seen them in northern Alberta and elsewhere, the devastation they cause. The Russian Arctic is going to become a wildfire zone. President Putin has two big problems in the Russian Federation, and it's not China. The big problems are these: wildfire, and they are getting worse. And we talk about zombie fires for a reason. We think they get exterminated in the winter, and then they come back again in the spring and wreak utter havoc. And the other thing that President Putin is going to have a real problem with is permafrost, frozen ground that thaws, goes mushy, like I said earlier. It's like a bag of peas to somebody in the break. This is really, really devastating. It's devastating because it releases methane gas, a potent, potent greenhouse gas. So if you think the warming trends are bad now, you just wait till the Arctic, both on land and underwater, starts to thaw. You really will be talking about really potentially catastrophic climate change or breakdown. But the other thing that will happen in the short term is it will really, really devastate buildings, infrastructure, including pipelines. And when I was in Svalbard, for example, I remember I got out of Svalbard, I took the flight back to Longyearbyen, and a week later, more thawing had occurred, and the airstrip in Ny-Ålesund was out of action, and that's further permafrost thaw. So the ground just gives way, it fractures, and everything goes. So the bill for the Russian Federation is going to run into billions and billions and billions of rubles or dollars or whatever currency we're working in. It's a huge problem, big problem in Alaska as well. Military installations are also suffering from permafrost thaw.
Just a quick word about mining, if you don't mind. And Adrian Cartwright wonders if there are any plans at present to mine minerals in either the Arctic or the Antarctic. And Haran Zeno wondering how much impact illegal drilling in the Arctic has had on the polar regions.
So the Arctic has experienced some form of mining for centuries. So one of the things I think sometimes doesn't help us is we think of the Arctic as a kind of winter wonderland, as a sort of environmental wilderness. It's far from it. There are parts of the Arctic that are so industrialized and so shot through, if you like, with evidence of mining that it is quite breathtaking. And that's not just the Russian Arctic, although it's certainly prevalent there. What we're going to see increasingly is more mining, not less, for all the reasons that I think everybody understands well. If we want to electrify the world, for example, we are going to need to mine. We're going to need all those critical minerals that we know help to make batteries, wind turbines, and a lot of those minerals are to be found in the Arctic. The other thing which is really important to say is that as indigenous peoples have secured greater autonomy and rights, those rights also apply to resources. So in Alaska, for example, for the last 50 years, indigenous peoples have transformed their lives by mining, either licensing mining or being involved in mining companies. And when mining companies come to the Arctic, they often provide not only employment, but also education, training, and they tend to put in things like roads. And, the funny thing is, a lot of governments will say in the far south, the Arctic is so terribly important. They won't necessarily always invest in the Arctic. So it often takes mining companies coming into these areas to provide crucial opportunities for peoples who are often heavily disadvantaged. So these are real game changers. And George Monbiot, if he was here, might say, well, this is terrible, this is awful, lots of mining in the Arctic. But then I'd have to give the other side of the story, which is for a lot of indigenous peoples, this is crucial in terms of helping them to have better lives. There are still lots of communities in Canada, Arctic Canada, that don't have access to safe water supplies. That's shocking. And it's so easy to forget that because 90-odd% of Canadian population, as you know, effectively live along the border with the United States. You forget that there's vast, vast territories that, are often having to experience conditions that, frankly speaking, you would see in some of the poorest areas in the global south. That's a harsh reality.
We're going to finish with those 3 questions here, which I hope are an opportunity for you to finish on a positive note, or a slightly positive note. Bob Bell says, in your talk you illustrated a huge number of problems. Can you forecast any of the potential solutions? Jeff Tucker, is there a positive pathway for the Arctic-Antarctic governance despite the disruptor countries? And Hugh Gladhill, have you any good news for my children and grandchildren?
Good challenges. I think when you study geopolitics and statecraft and borders, you often, I'm afraid, end up thinking about conflict, disruption, and all the unpleasantries of life. Look, I also have 2 children. One's at Lancaster University and the other is about to take her GCSEs. And I think about this a great deal myself. So let me just give you a couple of pieces of optimism to end on, because my children often say I'm a bit of a doom and gloom merchant. So here we go. Let me be optimistic for a second. It will pass, I promise you. Number 1, I think the Arctic has tremendous renewable energy potential. One thing the Arctic doesn't lack is wind. And some of the exciting projects that are going on all over the Arctic are looking to exploit renewables. And I think that's been really very exciting, because one of the big challenges for the more isolated communities all over the Arctic is they rely on diesel generators and often beholden to the importation of diesel. And that can be affected, for example, by wildfires. It can be affected by terrible ice conditions. And when it's minus 40 and you don't have access to diesel, that's not a laughing matter. So I think that's exciting. We're seeing some really nice projects, actually, in places like northern Canada that suggest there is another way, there is another world, if you like, and that's also possible for the Arctic. And the other thing I think it's worth saying is that actually we're starting to see some really noticeable improvement in the life opportunities for many northern communities, and we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. I think that's a really positive story. It's a positive story about a group of people's really claiming their civil and legal rights. So I think that's a second point. Thirdly, let's not give up. The Antarctic Treaty System still is intact. It is being stress tested, but there is plenty to play for, and we should not give up, because actually the Antarctic could be a whole lot worse if we didn't have this governance. So now is the time, as I was telling the European Union MEPs, it's a great opportunity for the European Union to reinforce yet again why our rules, norms, and values matter. And that also means being aware of the fact that you will have to make accommodations, but one of the things we've got to get better at is learning how to disagree well with one another, as opposed to constantly making things into an either-or, or imagining the world as perpetually split between one camp or another. And the final thing I will say is that actually often the very best comes out of us at moments of crisis. And one of the worst crises the Antarctic Treaty parties had was in the late 1980s, and they introduced something called the Environmental Protocol. And that protocol, amongst other things, said mining is permanently banned in Antarctica. And I think that's a good thing. I think there should be one part of the world where we don't mine, and that should be Antarctica. All that I'd like to leave you with is I would like to see the Southern Ocean enjoy the kind of levels of marine conservation that I think is perfectly possible, and actually that to be an exemplar of our better selves. And I think we're going to have to hold on to that, because as I said to my kids, it is going to get challenging, and we will, frankly speaking, need to pull together.
Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry if anyone's were not put, but I think we've just covered a huge amount of ground. Thank you to our two students this term, and for their questions too. We hope you have a good vacation. And would I ask you to stay just for a few minutes and wish everyone a happier Christmas while Klaus removes his headgear and then gets on the motorway to beautiful, leafy Richmond. But the rest of you, if you go back through that door, you've still got the chance to capture border wars, capture a border war. So do feel free to do that. I think it's been wonderful to see Klaus again. We've not seen him since well before the pandemic. And I said to him in the break, I think he's sort of matured like a good wine. And his lectures continue to inform, enthuse, and inspire us to try to understand that mysterious part of the globe. And as usual, I think his Q&A was fascinating. All that detail, a real expert. Thank you so much, Professor Klaus Dodds.